Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank you for agreeing to this interview. I was really happy when I got a reply from your assistant. Um, I've been actually a visitor to your state as a researcher before the pandemic, and I really
Where did
found
you
the
go?
memory of it. Independence. Um,
Okay.
I was a guest of the Truman Presidential Library. I received a research grant for my doctoral dissertation. Uh, so I got the chance to travel through Missouri uh, before the pandemic. That was my
It's
last voyage before the lockdowns.
the We're very lucky here in Kansas City to have the Truman Library.
Yeah,
And as you know, this is a very diverse state.
I know. Yeah,
It's an interesting place.
it is. With a really rich history. Something I didn't know before I actually came, and I was really happy to discover. Um, that's one of the reasons I asked you for interview, because we can consider Missouri, especially Kansas City, as one of the epicenters of American queer history. That's why I thought it would be important to hear from you about a topic that, after all, unites us from both sides of the Atlantic. Um, my first question to you is about the exhibit Making History, Kansas City and the Rise of Gay Rights, the State Museum of the Capitol Building. It was put together last September by the history students from the University of Missouri Kansas City around the story and significance of the homophile movement in the 1960s and the National Planning Conference of Homophile Organization of 1966. The governor, Mike Parson, removed it after 4 days, as I read. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so this exhibit was put together, I believe, in 2017 by the history department at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. It has won national awards here in the United States. It's traveled the region, and it just tells the story of, like you said, kind of the homophile movement, which is what the LGBT movement was called in the 1950s and 60s, and how Kansas City played a surprisingly larger role than one might expect. When our history is told, it's usually from a standpoint of what was happening in New York or San Francisco. And the rest of the country, while not as significant of roles, we did play a role and had a lot to do with the movement. This exhibit was to be displayed in the Missouri State Capitol in our Missouri History Museum. So the first floor of our state capitol is a museum, and there are permanent displays along the walls, and then there are rotating displays. And so it'll have something to do about a very specific piece of history or about art, music, etc. And this was to be up for about 4 months, and it lasted 4 days when the governor's administration got many emails from some of the more far right-wing legislators that were upset that it would, anything talking positively about LGBT Missourians would be displayed in the Missouri Capitol. And they very quickly succumbed to that pushback. I think because the governor's administration feared the public backlash that would come from the far right. I think what they didn't expect was that, this story would make news throughout not just Missouri, but the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and we've made papers in London, and now here I am interviewing with you. So I don't think they expected this to make international news for doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, actually, in Italy, we didn't hear about it. I read about it actually on the New York Times, and usually in Italy, our media pick up many stories from the US that are described as proof of the existence of a so-called cancel culture. Is usually merely as a clickbait opportunity, but here we have a real issue of cancellation by the authorities that wasn't mentioned anywhere here. in Italy. Do you think the media have been focusing on the wrong cancel culture?
Perhaps. I don't know how else you could describe this. I mean, this is real history that happened in our state, that was going to be told in our state capital, and it was canceled. It was literally boxed up, taken out of the Capitol building, and put in an auxiliary building to the side. And we have to make sure that these stories are told. It seems like here in the United States, and I think this isn't just an American thing, I think this is happening across the globe right now, is that, we're in a moment in the United States where there's a large portion of our culture, our people, who like to think of the United States only in the most positive lights. And there's obviously a lot that we as Americans have to be proud about. And I'm very proud of my country. But that isn't to say that we don't have darker parts of our history. We had slavery in this country for over 400 years. Women didn't have the right to vote. The treatment of Native Americans, the treatment of LGBT individuals. And I'm not going to keep listing because I'm going to leave somebody out and feel terrible. But we have to tell those stories. Here in the United States and across the globe, we have to learn from our past so that we don't repeat those mistakes. And it also gives us a path of how are we going to move forward, looking back to history to see a path forward or roadblocks that we want to avoid. And not studying this history does nothing to help us move forward.
Yeah. Related to that topic, I was today looking at the list of the laws that are pre-filed for the next legislative session. And there is much focus on what schools can actually teach pupils. And by the way, a lot regarding abortion. Do you think there is currently an effort by the GOP within a new wave of cultural wars to marginalize some communities in the US in a way resembling what was done with the exhibit?
I think what we are seeing is, especially when it comes to how to teach race in school, is we are seeing a political tactic, and one that unfortunately in our country has been successful throughout our history, which is to outrage the majority with teaching of how maybe things aren't great for minority populations. I think probably the most clear example of this was Nixon's Southern strategy of, sweeping the Southern states for the Republican Party and having a path to the White House that way. I think you're seeing something similar. You're going to hear a lot in the states about critical race theory, not just here in Missouri, but across the country. Why are we teaching our second graders, 7-year-olds critical race theory? Well, we're not. And banning critical race theory in elementary schools is like banning calculus in elementary schools. I mean, we're not teaching calculus to 7-year-olds. We're not teaching this either. What we have to make sure we don't do is, there's one piece of legislation that I saw that had something to the effect of, no history can be taught that doesn't show the United States in a positive light.
Exactly.
Well, that's asinine. That's ridiculous. We have to look at our dark parts of our history, shine a light on that so that we can be better people. And that's what we have to fight back about. But I think in the short term, this is an election year in the United States. I think it's a short-term election year win for the Republican Party because it will galvanize their base to come out and vote.
Yeah. And I have a personal question, but you as the first and only openly gay senator of Missouri, have you encountered the issue of being identified as the gay senator or something similar to what Pete Buttigieg had to go through?
I don't think I've really ever had a negative situation with being an openly gay member of the state legislature. What I do feel as the only openly gay senator in the state is a responsibility, one, to my district. So I represent the core of Kansas City, Missouri, in our state legislature, but to every LGBT person in the state. And I grew up in a very rural part of our state, farming community, a town of about 400 people. And when I speak on LGBT issues, I'm oftentimes thinking about that young person in a small town who maybe hears my words, maybe hears the words of someone who came from a town like them and now has the opportunity to be a senator from, the largest city in our state. It's a honor and a responsibility that I feel. And we're going to have a lot of bills this year and a lot of discussion about transgender Missourians. And it's unfortunately, we don't have any transgender representation in our state capital. But the LGBT community, that's not just letters that we say we are a community. And I'm going to be very proud to stand up for our transgender family.
Yeah, speaking of which, one of the laws that were pre-filed is the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, the MONA. The MONA has been introduced in the General Assembly for more than 20 years, thanks to the work of the recently passed Tom Hannigan. But it's failed to gain traction. What would it mean to pass this law?
First, I think there's the practical part of it, that it is still perfectly legal in the state of Missouri to fire someone from their job, to kick them out of their home, or deny them a meal at a restaurant because they are or you think they might be LGBT. When we are competing with other states in the country to bring 21st century jobs to our state, you also have to attract 21st century employees, and no one wants to come to a hate-filled state. So we have to protect our people, we have to protect our economy. But then there's also the message that it sends, once again, to those young people that are out there, that we want you in Missouri, that we appreciate you, we love you, and we care about you. And the Missouri General Assembly is going to stand up for you. I think all of those combined is a very important reason to get this passed. And I will say, I think there is a renewed effort, especially in the House of Representatives, with people who knew Representative Hannigan, who passed away suddenly a month or so ago, to try to get this passed in his honor. And so there are more discussions than normal this year about how can we maneuver this piece of legislation through the process and honor Representative Hannigan in that way. And I'd love to see that happen. He was a dear friend.
Could the decision by the Supreme Court last summer to expand the areas of application of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act give it momentum?
I think it may actually hurt because there are some that think that MONA is not needed now that was passed, and that only dealt with employment. Our Missouri Human Rights Statute, which this would add to, is actually a bit stricter about the size of employers that have to comply with the law. And of course, it deals with housing and public accommodations as well. So I think it gives the opposition a reason to say, well, this isn't really needed. Let's move on to the next issue.
Yeah, that's true. Speaking of your Republican colleagues, there are a few that are backing the effort to add gender identity and sexual orientation to the list of protected classes, including in the Missouri Human Rights Act. How has their base reacted in this polarized political climate? Do you find it difficult to establish a dialogue with the majority?
No, not at all. I mean, that's the funny thing, is that you have, before the passing of Representative Hannigan, you had 3 openly LGBT Republicans in the Missouri House of Representatives from 3 different parts of the state. You have Republican straight allies introducing MONA. There's no backlash. They're not getting that backlash. This is, I think, in legislative processes, the legislature generally trails the sentiment of their constituents. So we had seen that here in Missouri. For years, people had been on board with medical marijuana, and it took years before the legislature would get on board. There are loud voices throughout our state against LGBT issues, and it scares a lot of elected officials. But I think that the vast majority of Missourians just don't care about the issue. Why would you fire a good employee just because they're a lesbian? Like, that doesn't make any sense. I think that's the majority of Missourians' views. However, I think there is a incredibly loud minority that scares the majority party, that scares the Republican Party into inaction.
Yeah, something here in Italy, we have a story that really relates to that. We currently have a really fired up debate about a piece of legislation that would protect for the first time the LGBTQ plus community from hate crime. It failed to pass the Senate after years of compromising, partly because part of the coalition backed out at the last minute, adducing issues with gender identity and school teaching. Actually, Lady Gaga was in Italy last month, and she offered a message of encouragement on Italian TV after the law failed to pass. Seeing that you're experiencing a similar struggle, do you want to send a message to the Italian LGBTQ plus community, or even a few suggestions on how to manage with compromising with the so-called moderates?
Yeah, so you bring that up and several things popped into mind. First of all, Missouri was one of the few states to pass a hate crimes bill following the murder of Matthew Shepard in, I believe, 99. It's very important, at least with the way our law is written in Missouri, to keep in mind that, a hate crime is something different. And the example that I use with my colleagues when talking about this is if someone comes up and, just spray paints, anything on the side of a synagogue, that's one thing. If they spray paint a swastika, well, that's meant to intimidate and scare those citizens that are going to worship in that synagogue. And it's a very different crime than mere vandalism. So I encourage everyone to keep working on this issue in Italy. And why we need to study our history is to understand that, one, LGBTQ equality throughout the globe has happened rapidly when compared to other minority groups. Acceptance of LGBTQ people in Italy, in the United States, across Europe, North America, it's fascinating, but it didn't all happen at once. When we look at our history and we look at what this exhibit that was in the Missouri Capitol was talking about, was a ground building part of our history in the United States. We were setting up homophile organizations. We were laying a groundwork until the moment that was Stonewall happened. Had there not been the groundwork, Stonewall would have been a one-night event or a three-night event, and then just fizzled out. But it galvanized the community, and there was the mechanisms in place to sustain that energy. We see it, through the 80s with the AIDS epidemic and ACT UP popping up in New York and across the globe. These things, they tend to happen slowly, and then the dam breaks. And so I would encourage everyone, keep plugging away. Don't lose hope. Just keep chipping away at that. History is on our side. We will win these battles so long as we keep fighting for them. And it will take longer than we want. It'll be more frustrating than we want. And on some things, we might have to compromise. But we have to know what our core beliefs are. And one of that is that we are a full LGBTQ community and we can't leave anyone behind. But we have to just keep working on this. And, we're rooting for you here. I hope you're rooting for us there.
Yeah, we're doing.
Yeah.
And I have one last question for you, because I'm really curious about your opinion on this. Do you think that state chambers in the US do more effective work for the country than does the federal Congress?
It's a fascinating question. Let me think about how to answer that. You can say yes and no. So what we do in the state legislatures affect people's day-to-day lives much more than what happens in Congress. And Congress, unfortunately, today is very broken. Compromise has become a bad word. We've become a polarized society. And I hope this is a moment in time and we will get past it. So that leaves a lot of work to the states. And when you take it to 50 separate individual legislatures, you're going to get good and bad. And so what we do really does affect Americans' lives much more than what happens in Congress, with the exception of we just passed trillions of dollars in infrastructure funding. So we haven't invested in our infrastructure on a large scale in many decades. And we're about to, put people back to work and revamp our economy and make it a clean economy, more inclusive for all people. There are moments where Congress can do big things that individual legislatures simply can't. And so it's a difficult question to answer. On a normal day-to-day basis, yes, our state legislatures probably do more. But in those big moments, there's a great line from the TV series The West Wing, where it says there are times that we are 50 individual states and there are times that we're one nation. And in those times that we're one nation, Congress is so powerful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here, for agreeing to this interview. I wish you luck, you and the Missourian LGBTQ plus community